Part 3, Chapter 19 of The Job. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Job, by Sinclair Lewis. Part 3, Man and Woman. Chapter 19. So, toward the end of 1912, when she was 31 years old, Mrs. Una Golden Schwartz began her business career as confidential secretary to Mr. Truax of Truax and Fine. Her old enemy, routine, was constantly in the field. Routine of taking dictation, of getting out the letters, prompting Mr. Truax's memory as to who Mrs. A was and what Mr. B had telephoned, keeping plats and plans and memos in order, making out cards regarding the negotiations with possible sellers of suburban estates. She did not, as she had hoped, always find this routine one jolly round of surprises. She was often weary, sometimes bored. But in the splendor of being independent again, and of having something to do that seemed worth while, she was able to get through the details that never changed from day to day. And she was rewarded, for the whole job was made fascinating by human contact. She found herself enthusiastic about most of the people she met at Truax and Fine's. She was glad to talk with them, to work with them, to be taken seriously as a brain, a loyalty, a woman. By contrast with 2 years of hours either empty or filled with Schwartz, the office world was of the loftiest dignity. It may have been that some of the men she met were Schwartzes to their wives, but to her they had to be fellow workers. She did not believe that the long hours, the jealousies, the worry, or Mr. Truax's belief that he was several planes above ordinary humanity, were desirable or necessary parts of the life at Truax and Fine's. Here, too, she saw 9 hours of daily strain aging slim girls into skinny females. But now her whole point of view was changed. Instead of looking for the evils of the business world, she was desirous of seeing in it all the blessings she could, and, without ever losing her belief that it could be made more friendly, she was, nevertheless, able to rise above her own personal weariness, and see that the world of jobs, offices, business, had made itself creditably superior to those other muddled worlds of politics and amusement and amorous Schwartzes. She believed again, as in commercial college she had callowly believed, that business was beginning to see itself as communal, world-ruling, and beginning to be inspired to communal kingly virtues and responsibility. Looking for the good, sometimes in her joy of escape, looking for it almost with the joy of an S. Herbert Ross in picking little lucrative flowers of sentiment along the roadside, she was able to behold more daily happiness about her. Fortunately, Truax and Fine's was a good office, not too hard, not too strained and factional like Pemberton's, not wavering like Troy Wilkins's. Despite Mr. Truax's tendency to courteous whining, it was doing its work squarely and quietly. That was fortunate. Offices differ as much as office managers, and had chance condemned Una to another nerve-twanging Pemberton's, her slight strength might have broken. She might have fallen back to Schwartz and the gutter. Peaceful as reapers singing on their homeward path now seemed the teasing voices of men and girls as, in a group, they waited for the elevator at 5:35. The cheerful "Good night, Mrs. Schwartz," was a vesper benediction, altogether sweet with its earnest of rest and friendship. Tranquillity she found when she stayed late in the deserted office. Here no Schwirtz could reach her. Here her toil counted for something in the world's work, in the making of suburban homes for men and women and children. She sighed, and her breast felt barren, as she thought of the children. But tranquillity there was, and a brilliant beauty of the city, as across dark spaces of evening were strung the jewels of light, as in small French restaurants sounded desirous violins. On warm evenings of autumn, Una would lean out of the window and be absorbed in the afterglow above the North River, smoke clouds from Jersey factories drifting across the long carmine stain, air sweet and cool, and the yellow lighted windows of other skyscrapers giving distant companionship. She fancied sometimes that she was watching the afterglow over a far northern lake, among the pines, and with a sigh more of content than of restlessness, she turned back to her work. Time ceased to exist when she worked alone. Of time and of the office she was manager. What if she didn't go out to dinner till 8? She could dine whenever she wanted to. If a clumsy man called Eddie Schwirtz got hungry, he could get his own dinner. What if she did work slowly? There were no telephone messages, no Mr. Truax to annoy her. She could be leisurely, and do the work as it should be done. She was no longer afraid of the rustling silence about her, as Una Golden had been at Troy Wilkins's. She was a woman now, and trained to fill the blank spaces of the deserted office with her own colored thoughts. Hours of bustling life in the daytime office had their human joys as well. Una went out of her way to be friendly with the ordinary stenographers, and, as there was no vast Pembertonian system of caste, she succeeded, and had all the warmth of their little confidences. Nor after her extensive experience with Messrs. Schwirtz, Sanderson, and McCullough did even the noisiest of the salesmen offend her. She laughed at the small signs they were always bringing in and displaying. "Oh, forget it. I've got troubles of my own." Or, "Is that you again? Another half hour gone to hell." The sales manager brought this latter back from Philadelphia, and hung it on his desk, and when the admiring citizenry surrounded it, Una joined them. As a married woman she was not expected to be shocked by the word hell. But most beautiful was Christmas Eve, when all distinctions were suspended for an hour before the office closed, when Mr. Truax distributed gold pieces and handshakes, when Chas, the hat-tilted sales manager, stood on a chair and sang a solo. Mr. Fein hung holly on all their desks, and for an hour stenographers and salesmen and clerks and chiefs all were friends. When she went home to Schwirtz, she tried to take some of the holiday friendship. She sought to forget that he was still looking for the hypothetical job, while he subsisted on her wages and was increasingly apologetic. She boasted to herself that her husband hated to ask her for money, that he was large and strong and masculine. She took him to dinner at the Pequot, in a room of gold and tapestry. But he got drunk, and wept into his sherbet that he was a drag on her, and she was glad to be back in the office after Christmas. The mist of newness had passed, that confusion of the recent arrival in office or summer hotel or revengeful reception, and she now saw the office inhabitants as separate people. She wondered how she could ever have thought that the sales manager and Mr. Fein were confusingly alike, or have been unable to get the salesmen's names right. There was the chief, Mr. Daniel T. Truax, usually known as D.T., a fussily courteous whiner with a rabbity face his pink nose actually quivered, a little yellow mustache, and a little round stomach. Himself and his business he took very seriously, though he was far less tricky than Mr. Pemberton. The Real Estate Board of Trade was impressed by his unsmiling insistence on the dignity of the profession, and always asked him to serve on committees. It was Mr. Truax who bought the property for subdevelopment, and though he had less abstract intelligence than Mr. Fein, he was a better judge of "what the people want," of just how high to make restrictions on property, and what whim would turn the commuters north or south in their quest for homes. There was the super chief, the one person related to the firm whom Una hated, Mrs. D.T. Truax. She was not officially connected with the establishment, and her office habits were irregular. Mostly they consisted in appearing at the most inconvenient hours and asking maddening questions. She was fat, massaged, glittering, wheezy-voiced, nagging. Una peculiarly hated Mrs. Truax's nails. Una's own fingertips were hard with typing. Her manicuring was a domestic matter of clipping and hypocritical filing. But to Mrs. Truax, manicuring was a life work. Because of much clipping of the cuticle, the flesh at the base of each nail had become a noticeably raised cushion of pink flesh. Her nails were too pink, too shiny, too shapely, and sometimes they were an unearthly white at the ends because of nail paste left under them. At that startling whiteness Una stared, all the while Mrs. Truax was tapping her fingers and prying into the private morals of the pretty hall girl, and enfilading Una with the lorgnon that so perfectly suited her Upper West Side jowls. Collating Mrs. Truax and the matrons of the visiting board of the Temperance Home Club, Una concluded that women trained in egotism, but untrained in business, ought to be legally enjoined from giving their views to young women on the job. The most interesting figure in the office was Mr. Fein, the junior partner, a Harvard Jew, who was perfectly the new type of business man. Serious, tall, spectacled, clean-shaven, lean-faced, taking business as a profession, and kindly justice as a religion, studying efficiency but hating the metamorphosis of clerks into machines, he was the distinction and the power of Truax and Fein. At first Una had thought him humorless and negligible, but she discovered that it was he who pulled Mr. Truax out of his ruts, his pious trickeries, his cramping economies. She found that Mr. Fein loved books and the opera, and that he could be boyish after hours. Then the sales manager, that driving but festive soul, Mr. Charles Salmond, whom everybody called Chaz, pronounced Chaz, a good soul who was a little tiresome because he was so consistently an anthology of New York. He believed in Broadway, the Follies, good clothes, a motor car, Palm Beach, and the value of the Salvation Army among the lower classes. When Mr. Fein fought for real beauty in their suburban developments, it was Chaz who echoed all of New York by rebelling. "We aren't in business for our health. This idealistic game is okay for the guys that have the cash, but you can't expect my salesmen to sell this simplicity and high-thinking stuff to prospects that are interested in nothing but a sound investment with room for a garage and 2 kids." 60 or 70 salesmen, clerks, girls, these Una was beginning to know. Finally there was a keen, wide-awake woman, willing to do anything for anybody, not forward, but not to be overridden, a woman with a slight knowledge of architecture and a larger knowledge of the way of promotion, a woman whom Una took seriously, and the name of this paragon was Mrs. Una Golden Schwirtz. Round these human islands flowed a sea of others. She had a sense of flux and change and energy, of hundreds of thousands of people rushing about her always, crowds on Broadway and Fifth Avenue and Sixth, and on 34th Street where stood the Zodiac Building in which was the office. Crowds in the hall of the Zodiac Building, examining the black and white directory board with its list of 200 offices, or waiting to surge into one of the 12 elevators, those packed vertical railroads. A whole village life in the hallway of the Zodiac Building, the imperial elevator starter in a uniform of blue and gold, and merely regal elevator runners with less gold and more faded blue. The oldest of the elevator boys, Harry the Greek, who knew everybody in the building. The cigar stand, with piles of cigarettes, cans of advertised tobacco, maple fudge wrapped in tin foil, stamps, and even a few cigars. Also the keeper thereof, an Italian with an air of swounding romance. More romantic Italians in the glass-enclosed barber shop, desperate Desmond devils, with white coats like undress uniforms, and mustaches that recalled the Riviera and Baccarat and a Secret Service count. The 2 manicure girls of the barber shop, princesses reigning among admirers from the offices upstairs. Janitors with brooms, and charwomen with pails. And a red, sarcastic man, the engineer, and a meek puppet who was merely the superintendent of the whole thing. Una watched these village people, to whom the Zodiac Hall was Main Street, and in their satisfied conformation to a life of marble floors and artificial light, she found such settled existence as made her feel at home in this town, with its 18 strata called floors. She, too, at least during the best hours of the day, lived in the Zodiac Building's microcosm. And to her office penetrated the ever-flowing crowds, salesmen, buyers of real estate, inquirers, persons who seemed to have as a hobby the collection of real estate folders. Indeed, her most important task was the strategy of handling callers, the callers who came to see Mr. Truax himself, and were passed on to Una by the hall girl. To the clever secretary, the management of callers becomes a question of scientific tactics, and Una was clever at it because she liked people. She had to recognize the type of awkward, shabby visitor who looks like a beggar, but has in his pocket the cash for investment in lots. And the insinuating caller, with tailor-made garments and a smart tie, who presents himself as one who yearns to do a good turn to his dear, dear personal friend Mr. D.T. Truax, but proves to be an insurance agent or a salesman of adding machines. She had to send away the women with high-pitched voices and purely imaginary business, who came in for nothing whatever, and were willing to spend all of their own time and Mr. Truax's in obtaining the same. Women with unsaleable houses to sell, or improbable lots to buy, dissatisfied clients or mere cranks, old, shattered, unhappy women, to whom Una could give sympathy but no time. She was expert at standing filially listening to them at the elevator, while all the time her thumb steadily pressed the elevator signal. Una had been trained, perhaps as much by enduring Mr. Schwirtz as by pleasing Mr. S. Herbert Ross, to be firm, to say no, to keep Mr. Truax's sacred rights undisturbed. She did not conventionally murmur, "Mr. Truax is in a conference just now, and if you will tell me the nature of your business." Instead, she had surprising, delightful, convincing things for Mr. Truax to be doing, just at that particular moment. From Mr. Truax himself she learned new ways of delicately getting rid of people. He did not merely rise to indicate that an interview was over, but also arranged a system of counterfeit telephone calls, with Una calling up from the outside office, and Mr. Truax answering, "Yes, I'll be through now in just a moment," as a hint for the visitor. He even practiced such play acting as putting on his hat and coat and rushing out to greet an important but unwelcome caller with, "Oh, I'm so sorry, I'm just going out. Late for important engagement. Give my secretary full instructions, and I know she'll take care of you just as well as I could personally," and returning to his private office by a rear door. Mr. Truax, like Mr. S. Herbert Ross, gave Una maxims, but his had very little to do with stars and argosies, and the road to success, and vivisection, and the abstract virtues. They concerned getting to the office on time, and never letting a customer bother him if an office salesman could take care of the matter. So round Una flowed all the energy of life, and she of the listening and desolate hotel room and the overshadowing storm clouds was happy again. She began to make friendships. Chas., the office manager, stopped often at her desk to ridicule, and Mr. Fein to praise, the plans she liked to make for garden suburbs, which should be filled with poets, thatched roofs, excellent plumbing, artistic conversation, fireplaces, incinerators, books, and convenient trains. "Some day," said Mr. Fein to her, "we'll do that sort of thing, just as the Sage Foundation is doing it at Forest Hills." And he smiled encouragingly. "Some day," said Mr. Truax, "when you're head of a women's real estate firm, after you women get the vote, and rusty, old-fashioned people like me are out of the way, perhaps you can do that sort of thing." And he smiled encouragingly. "Rot," said Chas., and amiably chucked her under the chin. End of chapter 19.